Words are bridges.
शब्द सेतु हैं।
अल्फाज दिलों को और इंसानियत को जोड़ने का एक अजीम और तरीन पुल है।
വാക്കുകൾ പാലങ്ങളാണ്.
लफ्ज़ सरी कदलदारान
वहीनथुन
आखर हमार मेल सन आखर हमार जोड़
हफ्ते खमोइनर हेतु
Cocktail rock, yakraise.
Thuhi inkung kaina siam tu ani.
Ajrahana apati kisale.
Grauthaining yaukrai.
Shabda setu hun.
शब्दां दी सांस।
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, festival producer Sonjoy Roy, and all of us at Teamwork Arts, I wish you a very happy new year and welcome you back to our online series, Words Are Bridges. Through this series, we aim to highlight the wealth of literature in languages from India and across the world. Our session today is Folk Tongues and Creative Soups. Sukrita Paul Kumar in conversation with Aditi Maheshwari-Goyal. Sukrita Paul Kumar is a renowned poet, translator, and academic who is conversant across languages and cultures. Her books include Conversations on Modernism, Cultural Diversity and Linguistic Plurality in India, and Speaking for Myself, an anthology of Asian women's writing. Her recent collection of poems is Country Drive. In conversation with Aditi Maheshwari-Goyal, she speaks of her journeys across rich creative legacies and multiple tongues, with a special emphasis on the need to build critical consciousness about linguistic and literary diversity in India. A well-known poet and critic, Sukrita Paul Kumar was an invited poet and fellow at the prestigious International Writing Program, IOBA. Former fellow of IIAS and honorary faculty at Dural Center at Corfu, Greece, she has published several collections of poetry, translations, critical works, and has held exhibitions of her paintings. She held the Aruna Asif Ali Chair at the University of Delhi. Aditi Maheshwari-Goyal heads the Department of Copyrights and Translation at Vani Prakashan and is the managing trustee at Vani Foundation. She's the festival director of Hindi Mahotsav and secretariat manager of Vani Foundation Distinguished Translator Award. Before we move on to our session, we'd request you all to follow us on our handles JLF Lit Fest on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on all our upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our Facebook and YouTube pages. We now present Folk Tongues and Creative Soups. Sukrita Paul Kumar in conversation with Aditi Maheshwari-Goyal. Over to you, Aditi.
With our poet, critic, storyteller, the person who is synonymous with multilinguality, translations, connecting the bridges, connecting the world, Dr. Sukrita Paul Kumar. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Aditi. Lovely to see you and lovely to be on this session together.
As we are talking today about folks and soups and this beautiful phrase that you came up with a couple of nights ago, let's start with your life journey because it's been quite a soup. It's been quite a multi-winged folk. And how did it all start? There's a deep sense of international movement. There is a deep sense of multilinguality in your works, in your poetry, and I'm sure there is a story that is well lived, that is well breathed behind it. So I want to start with your childhood.
Yeah, so Aditi, I think it's, all our journeys start with childhood, don't they? And I think it's also important to see how the childhood that we are talking about as a past is actually very much there all the time in the present. And how does that get manifested? And how does it manifest itself in a variety of things that we end up doing as mature people or scholars or poets? But there is this little child that keeps peeping in a variety of ways from within, in a very emphatic fashion. And it takes a little bit of an inward journey, apart from the outward journeys that we undertake. It's an inward journey that actually tells you how to connect yourself with that self, which is sitting very quietly inside you. And how you creatively express yourself. I think it's in those moments of creativity that bonding also comes through, the bonding between one kind of self and another. And I think talking about journeys, I mean, one of the major journeys that always, in physical terms to start with, that comes to my mind all the time in a very vibrant fashion is my whole migration from, my movement from Kenya to Kenya, East Africa to India, and what that meant to me, And in fact, one of the poems that I wrote a long time ago, which was actually called Voyaging at 10, and it's actually, in one sense, all literature is autobiographical, right? It is through a certain kind of a lens of objectivity that you write, but the point is that you ultimately, it's very subjective. And that whole transition from subjective to objective is also a journey, right? And then when it becomes a little objective and communicative, that's when, through the creative process, there is a stamp of almost universality, call it, or impersonality or objectivity, and the poem becomes a poem because it refuses to be a diary, a mere diary. So I remember when I wrote this poem long time ago, this was actually some kind of an existential churning that happened within me as to what that voyage meant. Because, you must remember, I'm talking about 60s now, you were not even born then, but I migrated from Kenya with my father, writerly father, and parents. And why is that father? Because my mother, in any case, was from Kenya. She was born and brought up in Kenya. Okay. But my father was a refugee of partition times. And then he remained a refugee all his life. Once he became a refugee and then went overseas, went to Kenya. And for him, those 14 years of living there actually meant vanvas. He said it, so that has been my vanvas. Now, in his vanvas, he created a sense of homelessness actually for us children. Oh. And why I say that is because there was an imaginary homeland created for us, Homeland in the sense, I mean, it is supposed to be my home now, India. For a long time, it's been my home. But there has been a sense of homelessness because he always kept on persuasively saying this, we have to go back home. So that means where you were was not your home, right? Oh, okay. And that created a certain kind of restlessness and so on. And when we arrived here in India, it never felt like home because it was so different initially. It seemed so different in terms of climate, in terms of people, in terms of attitudes, everything, culture. And so there was a sense of homelessness here also, right? So where was my home, that imaginary homeland that Rushdie talks about? I think I lived through it on multiple levels. And I've been very conscious about that journey, from well, in a so-called way, to being in exile. When you're born there, you're made to feel you are in exile, right? All the time. And then when you are here, and then you again feel mentally, psychologically to be in exile because you're not homing. So homelessness, which is equivalent to me as shorelessness in a way, right? There is no shore inside. Where is that shore that one? And that had something to do with the physical journey that we did. It used to be not by flights. We used to come in the ships. And it used to take us 8 to 9 days to travel from Mombasa to Bombay. Okay. Yeah. And it was a beautiful journey because you would be seeing the sea with no shores in sight. And a lot of imagination would be evoked. A lot of imagination would be evoked. And that imaginative journey, it was an imaginary home that one was going to go to. So that, I think, were my creative yearnings and churnings, that journey itself, when you remain in transit all your life, right, physically, psychologically, and in every other way, intellectually. So there you are, then you end up in a place which is from one kind of multi-racial society, you go journey into another kind of multiplicity of languages, diversity of cultures. And then how do you deal with these two different kinds of diversities, as it were? So obviously one was dealing with it more in practical terms earlier, but later on it happened in creativity, in my creative work and in my intellectual pursuits, scholarly pursuits, or even in my choice of what kind of research I was to do. And then obviously also it took me to translation. And this translation also became a very personal journey, a very personal exploration of how to connect two languages. What do you see? What are the differences? What are the confluences? What are the divergences? How do you respect the divergence? You know, one had to learn that as well. And this all came, by and by. And as we go through this conversation, perhaps it would become more demonstrative. Right.
You were 10 when you were sailing, when you were...
Well, the poem is voyaging at 10, but I was 13 or 14 when we actually came to India. And each time it was a voyage, and we used to come every 2-3 days, thanks to the restless spirit of my father, who was looking for his home, back home kind of situation all the time. So every 2 or 3, 4 years, there was this journey that was undertaken, and each time with the desire to never go back to Kenya. So, but bread and butter would take you back. So one would go back.
Joginder Paul, a very iconic figure in the post-independence modern writing in the subcontinent. I can barely imagine the kind of conflict he's lived his life through, because he's trying to find home constantly. He's trying to find an expression constantly. He's trying to find his own niche, his own coterie. And in midst of all of this, he has a daughter. He has a daughter here who is trailblazing his contours and is trying to understand his conflicts, his struggles, and is trying to internalize everything and giving a literary expression to the entire experience of being a child of passionate parents, but internationally moving, trying to grapple two worlds, trying to hold them together into one hold called household. So in this journey, Sukritaji, when you finally came here at the age of 13, what were your first impressions? Because I think that's very unique, because we wouldn't ever get those impressions back in life when you are settled into this scenario, because we are sponges. We are very fresh sponges when we are kids. What were your first impressions? How did you feel when you landed, and how did you feel when you were going to, for example, a new school? How did you see this whole scenario changing around you?
Yeah, I think initially first, to come back to our initial theme, which is like, developing a folk tongue.
Right.
So I think the first thing that I did was to develop this folk tongue, because I was pretending. And the folk tongue has a double meaning. One is in the sense of folk tongue is used in the context of how there's a falsity on one side, and on the other side there is this truth. And the folk kind of is constantly in conflict, in terms of even the languages that you don't really evolve in, but you put on the linguistic demeanor or whatever.
Just to be accepted.
Yeah, to be accepted. So I was trying to, as it is, I was trying to deal with, my father was a writer in Urdu. So I was trying to deal with Urdu and Hindi in Kenya when these were not formally being taught, but we were being brought up, with Parag and Chanda Mama and Bal Bharti, all these magazines. And my first poem, by the way, I wrote was in Hindi. And it was written for Parag, and it got published. Yeah. So, and I thought that writing could never happen in our family in any other language but Hindi or Urdu, because my father was a champion for that. And so a lot of material was spread around. But if you do not get formal education in one language,
there's some discipline needed.
Then you have a sensibility, that linguistic sensibility got evolved in Hindi and in Urdu and in Punjabi and in Gujarati, because there was a lot of presence of Gujaratis in Kenya. But your primary language, you slowly discover, is English because of the formal training that you have. So no matter what your sensibility is, that then writing in English in itself becomes as though you are using a forked tongue. You know? So I think the creative soup may happen eventually, but the point is that forked tongue has to be reconciled with, right? You need to work it out that it can be brought to use rather than as an abuse, to languages. So I think we have to learn, and thanks to my father and thanks to my mother, who was also a linguist and a literature. And I think that legacy I owe a lot to, primarily because they brought these languages live into me in a big way. There was the informality and of those languages which came naturally, so to speak. And English was in any case getting naturalized through my education. So somewhere I learned to live in a multilingual situation, and not to speak of Swahili, which also I imbibed in Kenya, because we were talking in Swahili to the black people around. So there was another language, this is totally foreign in one sense, but you recognized some Arabic sounds there. So certain linguistic awareness, which is kind of passively being inculcated in one through childhood. And that, I think, got me to become sensitive to multilinguality of the kind that we are facing and we are living in India. And it came as a very stark reality, but because it was different, there was no foreign tongue here. This is a very naturally evolved plurality of languages here, If you have on this side of your house, if you have a Gujarati neighbor, on the other side, you may have a Bengali one. And in your house, you are speaking 2 or 3 languages, and you know how to contain them all. There is no strife. There's absolutely no strife. In fact, even when you're talking about, we are talking about cuisine, and if you're talking about, even if there is so much of diversity, but there is also a containing of this diversity. And I just pray that we learn to contain it more by way of understanding the value of this diversity, which actually feeds into our creative work in a very big way. Because if that just like in biology, you need diversity in your garden, you need diversity. In farming, you need diversity for fresh and new products to come up. So I think in creativity too, if you have that diversity, then there is a possibility for the imagination to grow even more expansive. And, the range becomes deeper. And that is why I think in our languages, in our bhashas, we have such rich creative literature. And who knows, but you would know that because you are in the middle of publication world, and, how these connections are very subtle. The connections between one language and another. So we are basically here thinking of, say, name it and you get it, whether it's in oral traditions like, Urao or such languages which we don't normally read about, and Gond language, or, there's so many languages which are existing only in orality. So whether in orality, there's also a kind of a very interesting interaction between the oral and the written that is happening in our country. That adds to the diversity, And in fact, to come to think of it, even the creation of Mahabharata, which they say contains everything on this earth, There is nothing that you can think of which is not in Mahabharata. And in fact, one of my books, which is to do with the tribal and the, folk traditions of Mahabharata, which I edited with Molly Kaushal, you know, we worked very hard to collect all these traditions of Mahabharata from different regions and put them together by, I mean, these essays are written by scholars and scholars who know those indigenous traditions of Mahabharata.
Right.
And it is amazing. If you look at that book, you realize, if you read through it, you realize that this diversity is a very vibrant diversity, which is looking at Ramayans and epics like Mahabharata and others in their own region, in their own fashion.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So interpretations would vary because the cultures are also in a way varied. But this, therefore, I'm coming to cultural diversity, right?
Right.
And this cultural diversity then feeds in further into preservation of languages, conservation of languages, and unfortunately, modern day education is actually like a tractor, you know. It is kind of, it's a leveler. It's just a leveler.
Bulldozer is the word.
Yeah, it's like you level it out, standardize, homogenize,
Right.
you know, and we all become parrots and monkeys, talking like each other, thinking
True
like each
that.
other's, you know.
Totally relate to you, yes.
Yeah. So we need to really, so literature is the answer to it all.
Right.
And this, you know, and I would like to go to that part of my journey, which was a transition from American literature, British literature as a student that I was doing,
Right.
to thanks to the kicks that I got from my home. Yeah, it was literally like, you know, kicking me around and saying, well, what the hell are you doing? And me, myself, you know, I was wondering, literature has to make sense to me first and foremost. I was trying to do that in my poetry, writing poetry. But even my academic world should be like writing a poem, creative, you know, existential journeys. So I did my PhD in American literature, but very soon I realized I needed to be on my own exploration and search of my identity. And if I'm talking about my identity, I need to know, how am I calling myself an Indian or a Punjabi or a, you know, Delhi wala or whatever? What is this existential reality? And I happen to be, when I was thinking and writing, that was the time when modernism was happening, right? Modernism was happening, Nai Kahani was happening in Hindi, Naya Afsana was happening in Urdu. So when Naya Afsana, Nai Kahani, and I was wondering, what is Naya in it, you know? I need to understand this. There was a lot of discussion in the house because my father was being termed as a modernist at that time. And now I would like to pay a tribute to our dear, dear departed Shamsul Rahman Farooqi Sahab, who passed away very recently, yesterday or day before. Yeah. And to him we owe, you know, this whole, the way he defined modernism in one sense for Urdu literature. And not just Urdu literature, there was U.R. Anant Murthy. He was talking about Kannada. And he was trying to define, writers were themselves trying to define what they were writing about and why and how they were writing. Right. That was a phenomenon which actually we haven't adequately acknowledged. That is writers on writing, you know.
That brings me to my most favorite theme to talk with you always, almost always. You've been writing these bursts of creative outbursts, these monologues, these essays. And you've been talking about your internal self. You've been talking about the process inside. You've been talking about its expression outside. How words are not only a mode of expression, but also a very restrictive territory at the same time. I'd request you to do a little reading from your poetry at this moment because I think I can explain my point a bit more clearer to all our audience right now. That how your words are not only traveling but are also expressing, but are also at the same time being very restrictive of the territories of the inside.
Yeah, I think, you know, I have obviously, you know, been traveling quite a lot also. And but wherever I go, my one way of internalizing that place is to try to, you know, absorb the cultural and the philosophic and the what would I say, a certain kind of an ambience around, you know. And how would my words capture that? I will just give you an example from one of the poems that I did, which is actually again a series which is called Pagoda Poems. And these Pagoda Poems came out of my visit to Vietnam.
Yes.
And so I'll just read one small poem from here. Again, I was trying to capture from my visit to the pagodas in Hanoi as to how I felt that there were poems hanging around everywhere in Vietnam. You know, they have a house, not just a house of culture, they have a house of literature, and they have a mountain of, which is called mountain of poetry or something in their own language. Okay. And in fact, the festival I went to was inaugurated there. And poems were sent into the universe through balloons, you know. All our poems, I don't know where they are now, but they were in the air, thrown away. And it was one was wondering, you know, that kind of an atmosphere where you have live poetry all around. And pagoda is you know, full of philosophic ramifications that you have on that place. Anyway, this is Pagoda Poems. I'll just read Pagoda Poem 1 and 2, right? 9 times over, the word nothingness emerges again and yet again in the 20-word poem by the master monk. The dragon, they say, descends into the sea, searching for meaning and spewing jewels that become rocks, piercing into valleys of more rocks. Columns of light rise, dressed in stunning colors, devils dancing in step with gods, all in all, adding to nothingness and making meaning. What is real? Image of the bird fluttering in the sky, or the one still, absolutely still, in the gushing river? The wavy moon in the water, or the one above that is steady, parallel, forever? That was Vietnam for me. Right?
Stillness, a lot of stillness.
So, and nothingness.
And nothingness. So this, is this nothingness, Sukrita ji, synonymous to existentialist? I won't say angst because that's too cliche, but is this synonymous to a kind of existentialist survival that you've been groping with, or this nothingness is about the shunya, the very shunya that our culture really glorifies, because it all emerges and it all goes back in there?
Aditi, I salute you for this question, because I was hoping that you might sort of pick it up. This is a word I use very differently from the existential nothingness of the Western kind.
Right.
And that is where my whole question of indigenized concept of even modernism evolves, right?
Right.
My nothingness here is the nothingness that we own here, which is closer to Shunyata. And I'm so happy that my translator picked the word Shunyata, Rekha Sethi, rather than anything else when she translated this very poem. And this, in fact, Vani published this book, you know, Samay Ki Kasak, and this poem is translated there, and it's there in that book. And it is to do with far more positive filling, filling in into the word nothingness than the negativity of the Western kind, you know.
Exactly. And that's what is going to take us to this whole idea of modernism, which is our modernism. And I can very proudly say, because we're childs of that. Our brand of modernism is entirely different from the very European or American brand of modernism. And why I'm saying brand, because these amazing theorists and philosophers brought out the kind of similarities in the kind of common thread in the works that were published in this era, in between the 50s and the probably early 80s.
70s, 80s.
Early 80s. But when it comes to the Indian subcontinent's modernism, I'm sure there is an entirely different understanding of it, because we have a partition, a very, very bloody partition behind our back. And our modernity is so much different from what we have understood through our textbooks at the universities. So I'd really want you to, come in after your 13 years, when you sailed to India, and now you are here maybe in your mid 20s, through your graduation, through your post graduation, into the world of this part of the world. And how are you grappling with this whole concept of modernism? And of course, from nothingness, existentialism, to the shunyata, to an entire a black hole, to a new black hole where everything is so full, which is not empty. So how are you grappling with this? So I am now mentally getting you in your mid 20s, early 30s, and I'm trying to understand that world through your own eyes. And how did you see that?
Yeah, you see, Aditi, when I got this fellowship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, this was primarily because I wanted to do this project on working out the indigenous modernism in the context of Hindi and Urdu in particular.
Right.
And I started exploring Hindi and Urdu literature, particularly Nai Kahani and Naya Afsana, read up a lot and wanted to do some critical reading as well. And unfortunately, there was a lot of dearth in critical writing on Adhunikta or, Jadidiyat and so on. And if there was anything to be found, everybody seemed to be talking about how imitative this modernism in India was of the Western context.
Right.
So that is what I wanted to really defy, because I had seen within my own home modernist writing happening with a lot of authenticity and a lot of commitment to reality and experiential reality. And as you very rightly pointed out, this whole question of the backdrop of partition actually led to a certain cultural crisis. And this cultural crisis, I think, is what created a whole scene of the kind which made writers, and more writers in our case, in the West, when modernism happened, it came forth as a kind of, it was a vortex of images that happened. And all those images came from the artist as in painters,
Right.
But in our context, yes, of course, in painting and art also it happened, but in writing, the way it evolved, and there was a sprouting of short stories in particular, less novels, but more short stories. And in fact, if you know, and you would know, there was this magazine called Nai Kahani also. And all these people, Mohan Rakesh and
there was a lot of
Nirmal
theater
Verma
also happening,
yeah, a lot of theater, everything. Modernism was being lived out creatively, understood creatively, but there wasn't adequate critical thinking on it. So my project could not have happened in the conventional sense. So in one sense, this book that happened, which we call Conversations on Modernism, it happened primarily because of my desperation in trying to understand this modernism. So who but these wonderful writers who were living at that time, all of them, Nirmal Verma and whole lot of them,
Kurutul
and Naidar, Jilani Bano, all of these people. And I thought, okay, let me also have a couple of them from Pakistan, Wazir Aga, Muhammad Ali Siddiqui, Saab, all of them very kindly were open to it, because unlike the earlier writers, of course, off and on writers have been talking about their writing practice. But in this case, what was required was that these writers themselves, in a sense, articulate as to why they were doing literature the way they were doing. Right. What was it that was pushing them to do it? And they wanted to justify that or explain that to themselves and also to the whole world, as to what was happening. Right. And so I decided to choose these writers and critics and philosophers and, go to them, have conversations with them and discuss them and cull it out of them. Just cull it out of them as to what their concept was of modernism. And so if you read this book, Conversations on Modernism, which you have published at Vani, you would be sure to see that there isn't one kind of modernism, but there are many modernisms. Yeah.
Yes.
And you cannot define it in one frame only. So every writer, and therefore I did not have standard questions which I was giving to everybody. No, I was reading up that author, going to the author and having a discussion and making that person talk about the process and concept.
Right.
And so I think I feel very happy that the book brings out some kind of an understanding of how modernisms were happening, particularly in Hindi and Urdu, and how therefore, and in fact, modernism continues to happen in our country, just as the bullock cart still exists, even if there is a jet overhead.
So there is a Merc, there is a bullock cart, there is a rickshaw, there is a three-wheeler, all standing together at a signal in India. So that's our reality. That's what we are.
Exactly. And that is the creative soup, isn't it? Which we have to keep dipping into. And we don't adequately, we need to have a critical sense as well. We need to have a critical sense to be able to respect this phenomenon that was taking place in 60s, 70s, 80s, very fervently, very passionately, and continues to be with us. And unless we understand it, how do we move forward? We cannot be futuristic unless we have our feet dug deep into the present, which contains the past.
That's true. So that's my favorite question that I've perhaps asked all my teachers all my life. So whether it was Professor Alok Rai, Professor Harish Trivedi, and now you, one question that I'd come back to, and I've never found one answer to this, and I'd like to know what your answer is, that are we ever going to get into the post-modernist, post-structuralist, post-anything world, or are we going to be modernists all our life as a culture?
Yeah, Aditi, I think we are post as well. The kind of modernism I'm talking about, or my understanding of modernism, tells me that this modernism contains within itself a post and a pre. Right? There is a pre, and it's a very fulsome modernism. Because as Namar Singh, I think, says somewhere, that dynamism of modernism that you see here, the dynamism is actually very aptly containing sense of tradition. And that's our modernism, you see. We have that firm sense of tradition, which we do not defy, but we contain it in moving forward, right? And it's not to be seen as a burden. It's a point of inspiration. And that point of inspiration, even if it is overturning the concept, and in the overturning of the concept, there is also something that is scattered, right? In the scattering of it all, there are elements of postmodernism. That's where you see relativity of truth and so on. And that's happening. It's been happening. When modernism was happening, at that when it was initiated, even at that time, this fragmented reality that I'm talking about had elements of the post in it. And if I'm allowed to go and sort of give you an example of one of the stories of my own father, in which he says, it's called, I think it is called Pool, I'm not sure. But in this story, there are two people, and they're in dialogue with each other, and they're very poor, extremely poor, and very hungry, very, very hungry. And there, within that, there is a kind of a alley created in the psychology of the two through the simple conversation that they are having. So usme refrain hai, or again, the refrain comes again and again. Oh, I'm very hungry, one of them says. The other one says, here, have this. And it's all happening in imagination. So he says, Are, khajur to badi meethi hai. These dates are lovely. They're so sweet. And he says, and here is some water as well. So, the entire metaphor that grows out of it is as to how hunger makes you create in your imagination.
Wow.
And it is actually initially a scattered reality, that hunger makes you go hither and thither, and you can't contain it all. But how do you connect also? So the connections, the ruptures and the connections are together there. And the truth of one man is shared by the other.
Yes.
By the
So,
other.
on this note, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking out time for this. And I'd also want to point out here that Herta Müller, the 2009 Nobel laureate for literature, she wrote a book called Atom Chaukal, which is translated to Hindi as Bhook Ka Vyakran. And this whole theme that Saab talked about, in 70s and 80s, or maybe before that, so resonates in this part of the century as well, when she's recalling the experiences of her Jewish ancestry, of her German ancestry, and talking about how these concentration camps were personifying the whole idea of hunger. So I think, we have this universal theme here. Sukrita ji, thank you so much for taking out time for all of us. And this lovely, cozy conversation is all that we need in these tough times. And thank God for poets like you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditi. Thank you so much. And thank you, JLF, for giving this space.
Thank you, Sukrita and Aditi, for that beautiful session. If you all enjoyed watching this session, please do share with your friends and family through your social media pages. We will be back next week on Thursday, 14 January at 7 p.m. with the following session: Tirupavai, The French Connection, Vasumati Badrinathan in conversation with Her Excellency Sonia Barbary, Consul General of France in Mumbai. See you all next week. Have a great evening.